Welcome to our Wednesday night Bible study. Jim Morgan, Aaron Tremblay here with the Smyrna Church of Christ, continuing our study in Paul's letter to Timothy, his second letter to Timothy. And just want to let you know that we are again having Bible classes in person. So this same class is being taught on Wednesday nights at 7 o'clock. And on Sundays, we also have an adult class that's being held in the auditorium immediately following our worship service. And this week is the start of a brand new series of lessons with a brand new teacher. So our brother Jerry Burgess will begin a 4-week series teaching from the Bible. So we encourage you, if you haven't had an opportunity to come to our worship or our Bible class, this Sunday will be as good as any to come back, be able to meet with the brothers and sisters and hear from Brother Jerry teaching from the Bible. So that's pretty exciting. And also we have half of the auditorium is masked and half is unmasked. So just want to make everybody aware of kind of the things that are going on Sundays.
Lots of options. And don't forget, we also have teenage classes now.
We do. We have our youth and our teens are meeting, and in just a couple of weeks we'll begin having our children's classes as well. So if that's been something that you've been waiting for to have available for your children, it is coming to the Smyrna Church of Christ near you.
And it will be done as safely as possible.
Correct. We will still be taking precautions.
Priority is still going to be everyone's health. There's no way that we're going to rush back into this. We can keep going for as long as we need to keep going.
Absolutely.
Don't like it, but we can do it.
We can do it if we have to. So we actually finished in our last time together in 2 Timothy. We finished at the end of chapter 2. And we were talking about those qualities and those characteristics that were so important for Timothy to have. If you remember back in verse 22, flee those youthful passions, and then Paul gives him what to replace it with. You never want to just clean out your house of the bad things and not put any good things where the bad things were, or you're just going to have twice as many bad things as when you started. So Paul says, flee from the youthful passions, flee from the sinfulness, but fill your life with righteousness, faith, love, peace. And he moves on later to talk about the idea of gentleness in dealing with other people and patience. The reason I want to go back and just kind of highlight those qualities is because what we're about to read in this first section of chapter 3 is a complete absence of each one of those characteristics.
Yeah, and there does come a point, and it should be after a long, drawn-out process, not the first thing we try. But there does come a point where even God has an end to his patience.
Absolutely.
And if God has an end to his patience and he finally just says, okay, that's it, flood, then there's going to come a point. There's a process in Matthew where it talks about, okay, if you and your brother have got a problem, okay, first of all, just get the two of you together and work it out. If you can't do that, then bring in a few more people. Then you bring in the church. And after that, then you treat him like, go through withdrawal of fellowship.
Sure.
So it's a long process, but it can't just keep going and going and going and going, because what will happen is it'll end up splitting and it'll end up destroying the church.
We can't just continue in sin to let grace abound. That's another thing that Paul talks about is problematic. I think it's a good example. The flood, God calls Moses up on the mountain and says, I'll raise a new nation out of you. I'm going to destroy everybody again. And only because of Moses' pleading with God does God change his mind there. Certainly it must have been a struggle for Jesus. I always, in my mind, talk about the idea that Jesus didn't have a hard time not calling the 12 legions of angels to come down, because his training to prepare him for that was not doing it to his own disciples, because they had frustrated him and let him down so many times. Okay, and I say all that to kind of back up your point that God has a limit to his patience.
Well, one day we know that this world's going to come to an end.
Correct.
Because nobody knows it, not even the Son. But one day there's going to come a point where God says, okay, that's it. Now, we don't have any idea what's going to happen past that, but we do know that at some point God's going to say, that's enough.
And so Paul is encouraging Timothy. He's telling him what kind of person he needs to be as a Christian, as one who calls himself by the name of the Lord. And he talked about that earlier on in chapter 2. But when we look at chapter 3, Paul is laying out for us the contrast that Timothy is seeing, will see in the people around him. That doesn't change the obligation, the commitment that he has to pursuing righteousness and faith and love. And those things, but I think it's important what Paul's trying to do for Timothy is have him, instead of walking around in the dark, have his eyes wide open to what it is that he's going to have to face.
Yeah, and I think, there's 2 points here. One is that up until this point, Paul's been talking about false teachers. And it's so easy to say, well, he's exaggerating. It's not really that bad. This is all minor. Paul said, no, this is what they're doing. Mm-hmm. And so now he's going to get down to brass tacks, or, the nitty gritty, or whatever you want to call it. But he's going to say, no, it is every bit as bad as I said it is. Here's what these people are doing.
Sure.
As a matter of fact, he begins in chapter 3, verse 1. There's going to be terrible times. Mm-hmm. Well, okay, that sounds like today, but nonetheless, there's going to be terrible times.
Sure.
Oh, Paul, no, let me tell you what's going to happen. Mm-hmm. And the second thing I think that it's important to remember here is there's been an emphasis over the last chapter or so of you're going to have to be teaching people to be leaders and teaching people to be teachers and mm-hmm. to defend the faith, because with all of these people that he's talking about having left the church, there's a vacuum. And somebody's going to have to step up and fill that vacuum.
Absolutely.
So Timothy is, in a place in Ephesus, is a place that's very important in the church. Okay, we're going to need some more people to step up here. Okay, mm-hmm. you can't just step back and watch all this happen anymore. These guys are gone. Demas has gone back to the world. Philetus and Hymenaeus, they're gone. Somebody's going to have to take their place. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's the reason why. Now we've talked about what they need to do to get ready, and here's the reason why. Because these people aren't coming back.
Correct.
As much as we would like to think they are, you have to just reach an assumption somewhere along the line, these people aren't coming back. Somebody's going to have to take their place.
That's a good point. And, as you were mentioning early on, places like this here in Timothy, 2 Timothy 3, Romans chapter 1, a lot of places in the New Testament that talk about the state of the world the state of the world at that time, and we read it and we say, now wait a minute, this could have been written today.
Yesterday.
Right? I mean, as
it's in the mail today.
Yeah, and Romans 1 just talks about the lawlessness and selfishness that people have and the violence that people have. Mm-hmm. And it certainly is in no way unique to us today, nor to Rome. It covers everything in between and everything before, going back to Cain and Abel even. And,
that's one thing that's fairly unique about the Bible. One of the reasons why we believe it's from God is because it's not wearing out. Mm-hmm. It's not becoming obsolete, but instead, like you said, it's as if this were written yesterday. You look at some of the mythology, the Greek and the Roman myths and, their religious laws. Mm-hmm. There's no way in the world that's going to fit today. Even some of the religions that, we are more modern now.
Sure.
You look at them and even their own followers have to admit, well, yeah, we're not really cutting people's hands off for the most part.
Correct.
But, there's something about the Bible that says that this speaks to everyone.
Yeah. And, even as we're looking here in the text in chapter 3 and verse 1, when it talks about this idea of the last days, sometimes we read that phrase and we think in terms of some far-off distant point in the future that we're going mm-hmm. to see these things, or that they were going to see these things. But, in fact, as Paul is writing that, he's writing to Timothy in the midst of what conceivably is the last days, because Jesus could have come back the week after he wrote this.
Yeah.
And when you talk about the last days, not every time in Scripture, there's kind of 2 ways it's utilized. But one of the ways it's utilized in the New Testament is it's talking about the period of time prior to the coming again of Jesus. Well, by that definition, they were living in the last days, as well as now we are living in the last days.
Yeah. Of course, Paul, back in 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, he says, we know that the second coming is not imminent because the man of lawlessness has not come yet. Mm-hmm. Well, as far as I can tell, he still hasn't. Correct. So, Paul is, when he says the last days, obviously he's not thinking of, the second coming of Jesus is imminent, because until the man of lawlessness comes, and I think that's Domitian.
Yeah.
Okay, Titus and Domitian. Mm-hmm. Until that happens, Paul says, until all prophecy is fulfilled, this world's going to go on. Mm-hmm. Now,
at least
the man of lawlessness has finished. All the prophecies have been fulfilled now, except the second coming of Jesus. Now we live in a period where, we can't say, no, it's not going to happen.
Correct.
Paul could.
Yeah.
So when he talks about the last days here, I think it's much more likely that he's looking at, and remember, we're just a little ways away from when Nero's going to die, the empire is going to collapse, the Jewish temple is going to be destroyed, the church is going to be scattered all over the place. Mm-hmm. I think that's what he's talking about, and that's also the reason why he's so desperate. We got to get leadership in place because hard times are coming.
Yeah, the hard times are imminent.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so, that's the reason why 2 Timothy is here. All the times before, Paul could say, well, Peter and I'll be there. We'll, go where we're needed. And Paul's come to the realization now, starkly, I'm not going to be here. Somebody else is going to have to handle this crisis.
And that someone else is you, Timothy.
Yeah, Timothy, this one's your job. But, it's kind of a thing. You read in the Gospels, and there's so much in there about, the destruction of the temple,
mm-hmm.
and all the things that are going to happen. And I imagine Paul always thought he was going to be there to see that. And all of a sudden he comes to the realization, this is going to go on without me.
Mm-hmm.
And so again, when he talks about the last days, he's not talking about the second coming of Jesus, because there's so many prophecies that still haven't been fulfilled.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think when he talks about the last days, the terrible times, it's the same thing that Jesus talks about in Matthew 24 and Mark 13 and Luke, wherever it is in Luke. But in those days, if it wasn't for the fact that God's going to stop it, everything would be destroyed here.
Mm-hmm.
There are going to be horrible times coming. And so I think that when he talks about that, he's talking about the destruction of the temple.
Up
until now, the church has pretty much been able to focus on, we know who the enemy is. It's the Jews.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now the Jews are about to be removed as an effective force. And great. We substitute the Jews for the Romans.
Yeah.
So, we're going to have some strong leadership. And about that time, as far as we know, the only apostle that's going to be left is John.
Yeah, and he's not necessarily accessible.
No. And if he's accessible here, he's not over there.
Correct.
So, when you've only got one apostle, he's going to have to choose his spots very, very carefully, which is why I think that John doesn't do any writing until late in his career,
mm-hmm.
is because, in 2nd and 3rd John, he talks about, I could write a lot about this, but I hope to come see you. And he comes to realize, I can't do that.
Can't be
everywhere. And that's why I think that 2nd and 3rd John are his first letters.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, that I hope, I hope to be able to come to see you. When he realizes he can't, that's the Gospel of John is produced.
Mm-hmm.
And then later after that, when that problem's taken care of, he produces Revelation. But if you'll notice, John doesn't do anything written until after all of the other apostles are dead, as far as we know.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that we're really reaching a crisis of leadership here, and there are not going to be any more apostles. There's not going to be any more miracles. There's not going to be any more inspiration. The church is now going to have to stand on its own 2 feet.
And a crisis of leadership is twofold. One, a lack of leaders.
Mm-hmm.
And 2, it's a time of crisis, so you need leaders.
Yeah, and the leaders that you've been looking to are now the guys you don't want to be following.
Correct, yeah. So it's a tempest of issues.
Yeah, and that's why he says, mark this. There's going to be terrible times in these
mm-hmm.
last days.
Yeah, and the struggles and challenges that the church faces are positive. God ends up working them out in a positive way. For instance, with the scattering of the church turns out to be a good thing, but nonetheless still challenging.
Oh, yeah.
And so he begins...
All of the good lessons are hard ones.
Yeah, exactly. He begins laying out what people will be like. And again, as we look through this list, I think it's worth acknowledging that it's not so much, I think, that Paul's trying to say that people have never been this way before, but that these qualities and characteristics of people will become amplified in this time. And truly that's what happens. I think we've even kind of seen that, and not that I'm trying to compare, just dealing with a pandemic to, genocidal leaders of the government in the time of Rome, but I think we kind of even could see this through some of the struggles we've gone through. Your best either is going to shine through in the midst of crisis and calamity, or your worst is going to come through.
Yeah.
And it really defines or forces your character to be shown for what you do in the midst of those difficult
mm-hmm.
times. So I think that's kind of what Paul's saying. We're not looking at this and saying, oh man, nobody has ever been this way before, but now in this time they're going to be. No, it's these qualities are going to be amplified in the world because distress is going to be upon the world.
Yeah, and we have God's word for it that the worst that the world could ever be has already happened, and that's back with the flood.
Correct.
Because he says, "I'll never again have to destroy the world," because you were down to one family,
mm-hmm.
and God says, there's not ever going to be a reason for this to happen again. So the worst of the world is already past.
The worst of the world and the worst city of the world have already been dealt with.
Yeah, but that doesn't help us if we're living in second place.
Correct. Correct. Yeah, we're not trying to see how close.
My crisis is always the most important one.
So let's look at some of these things that
Can I
Paul
add
talks
one
about.
more
Go
thing?
ahead, yeah.
Okay. Before we start, people be lovers of themselves. I think it's interesting to look back where he finished in chapter 2.
Mm-hmm.
He says the Lord's servant, and then he lists a whole bunch of things that are going to be the direct opposite of what he's talking about here.
Correct.
He talks about this is the way the Lord's servant's going to be, but here's the way these guys that used to be the Lord's servants, this is the way they have become.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a terrible thing.
And again, it's that crossroads that happens in crisis.
Yeah.
Where you have to make this choice. And sometimes when people get hit with that pressure, it's easier to cave than it is to stand firm.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, it's hard. I mean, look at what he says there in 24. He begins with the fact not quarrelsome, but kind to everybody.
Mm-hmm.
Now, let's be honest. Kind to everyone, that's not easy on my best day when I wake up and everything's going just the way I want it to.
There's some people who just don't deserve kindness.
Kind to some people, I can handle that. But on my best day, trying to be kind to everyone is a challenge.
Mm-hmm.
Never mind when I'm in the midst of crisis and there's a lack of leaders and there's false teachers in the church and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
And then I'm still trying to be kind to everyone. So, again, I think it's this idea of when the pressure comes of crisis or circumstance we're in the midst of, you either break and bow to it or you stand firm in the midst of it. And I think that's why Paul lays those qualities out at the end of 2 first, and then gives us these ones in 3. So people will be lovers of self. And I think there you go is a direct contrast to kind to everyone, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, kind to everyone, that's a selfless thing. And he says they'll be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, proud, arrogant, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, and unholy. So there's a whole lot more, but let's try and take these things in at least verse-size bites. I think we would look at these qualities that he lays out in this first section here. It's speaking to motivators that people have, heart issues, right?
Mm-hmm.
Lovers of self, lovers of money. It's not necessarily, now those things are evidenced in the fruit in the people's lives, so I can look at somebody and I might be able to judge by their actions, but without the actions, I don't know if they're lovers of self.
Yeah.
So these are internal struggles, right? Lovers of money, pride, arrogant. You might say abusive is something that's more of a demonstrative quality. Disobedient to parents, ungrateful, unholy. Okay, but these are all struggles and challenges. Again, I think that we can look around the world right now and see that these things are still existent in worldly people.
And they've either been amplified or overcome.
Mm-hmm. Correct.
It's not the circumstances; it's how you react to the circumstances.
And the struggle we have, I think, as Christians, and again, we're taking this and we're trying to say, okay, what does this have to speak to us in our day and time?
I know this one.
The more that we have, there's this temptation I sense right now in churches to conform to the things that the world is telling us. This is what you need to be talking about. This is what you need to be preaching. This is what you need to be supporting. This is how you should be addressing things. The world is putting all these pressures on churches to get their speech and their priorities in line with what the world is telling us is important right now. And the struggle is not so much when we see these qualities in the world, because the world has always been that way and the world's never going to change from being those things. The problem is when the church, the people of God, begin to cave to those pressures, and you begin to see Christians defined as, or Christians in name at least, defined as lovers of self, lovers of money, proud, arrogant, abusive, disobedient, ungrateful, unholy. I mean, it's one thing for the world to be that way, but it's something else when the world begins to influence the church to be that way.
Well, I think, the first one there, people lovers of themselves, 2 words. Profound philosophical concept here. Toilet paper.
Mm-hmm.
No sooner had this started than what happened. People go out and they start hoarding.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to get the stuff. They're going to bring it in. How many times have certain foods been out of stock? How many times have this been out? You can't get this because people have come in and bought it all up. You can still, if you go into Walmart, for example, which most everybody does, there's still vast shelves that are just empty. Why? Because people have come in and you'll see them going out. Back a few months ago, found a place that had toilet paper. And I asked the girl as I was checking out, I was only about half serious. I said, do I get an armed guard to my car? And she said, no, sir, you're on your own, and I don't even have a bag. But, it brings out.
Sure.
Okay? Am I concerned that if I buy 50,000 things, somebody else is not going to get any? Can't help it, man. I got to take care of me. And I think that has come out.
And people justify it by saying, if I don't buy it all, then whoever comes after me will. So it's not going to help anything for me not to be like
Which is
everyone
still
else.
a lover of myself.
Correct.
Because, I got to beat this guy. What we're saying is, that guy's doing bad, so I'm going to do it first.
Right. Let me be the one.
Yeah.
And I think it goes farther than that. In some of the perspective we sometimes see creep in of being lovers of self coming into the church. And a lot of times, Sunday is one of the most selfish days of the week in terms of people come to church and they want their parking spot and they want their seat and my seat, my parking spot, sing my songs. I don't like those songs. Sing the ones I like. I want my Bible class. That's on what I want to hear about. I want my sermon. Don't preach on that stuff. I want what I want to hear about. And man, when we get into that mode of thinking, and we may not, hopefully we don't walk through that specific of a process in our mind, but if our attitude becomes that way, that we expect what happens at church to revolve around us and our preferences and what's comfortable for us, then I think that's a indicator that this attitude has begun to slip in.
Yeah.
And Kennedy, a fellow Massachusetts native, he had this saying about...
Are you going to edit this part out?
Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. It's a profound statement that people remember, and what I take out of this statement at least is he was saying, let's try and take self off the throne or off the place of priority and put the collective ahead of self.
And it didn't work then, and it's still not working if you're dependent on the government, if you're depending on the world. It's never going to work because the world has to be based on what I can get from myself. Because if you don't believe there's anything past the grave, then the only time you got to get it is right now.
And that's why it should have no place in the church.
Yeah, because our hope is beyond.
Correct. We should be asking, what can I give, not what can I get when it comes from the church. You've already gotten everything there is to get out of Christianity. You got the Son of God's blood that he had to shed on your behalf to get you eternal life. Now your question needs to be, what can I give, right?
Yeah.
So lovers of self, we got to be careful with that one. The idea of hoarding, self-preservation above all else, or self-service above all else, we really got to be careful, I think, letting that attitude creep in, and it comes from the world. The world teaches us it's okay. If you don't take care of you, who's going to take care of you, right? But we have
got to look out for number one.
That's right, and it's all about me being comfortable, and I'm who's most important, and all those things. We got to be
There's a certain
careful.
pressure in a football that I like, and therefore.
Yeah, exactly. Lovers of money, I think, is self-explanatory, man. Just like lovers of self.
It follows from the first one.
Yeah, that goes right back to the beginning.
Well, yeah, it's what we were just talking about. If you don't live for spiritual riches, then you live for physical riches. And when that comes into the church,
it's a huge problem. And look, sometimes we think we can easily escape that. We don't have to pay attention to that. That's not going to be a problem for me, because maybe I don't have a lot of money, so money's not a problem for me. Or maybe I do. Maybe I'm wealthy, so money shouldn't be a problem. But this goes back to Solomon had a problem, I think, kind of being a lover of money there for a while. You say, well, what's the evidence? His palace was twice the size of the temple. I think that tells you something. But,
and taxes.
Yeah, and taxes. And it creeps in. Look at Judas. If someone in Jesus' inner circle can become a lover of self and a lover of money, it tells me that there's a potential for this to be an issue for me. Pride is really big, and I don't think we talk about or deal with pride enough. Even if you do everything that's right, according to the way you're instructed by the Bible, if you follow the Word of God to the letter, but you are prideful, then you still fail. And, if I pursue the knowledge of the Word of God, which is a good thing, but I'm prideful about it, then I just undid a good pursuit. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And, looking at what you're talking about here, it just struck me, okay? So probably I'm going to need to go back and edit this too, but it just struck me that we were talking about what the last days are. If it's really the days coming of the temple, the Jewish attitude towards life and the temple is every one of these. Lovers of themselves, lovers of money. Okay, the temple had gotten to the point where they got so much money that they couldn't spend it all. So they started a gold chain that ran around the top of the temple, and it had run around 2.5 times by the time it was destroyed. Why? Because look at our temple. Remember when Jesus is talking about the destruction of the temple, what ticks him off is the disciples say, Lord, look at these buildings, look at all of this.
Yeah.
They're taking pride in that, and it's all about to be destroyed. Lovers of money. Well, the Pharisees are fairly well known for that. But, the problem is all of this can be taken away. Your money, you're going to be taken into slavery, people. Your temple is going to be burned to the ground. All of the stuff in it is going to be taken back to Rome and put in a pagan temple.
Yeah.
Proud, boastful, proud, abusive, disobedient to their parents, still fits in with what Jesus was talking about. You're supposed to take care of your parents, but you say, well, I can't. I've made an offering to the temple.
With Corban, yeah.
So, all of this fits into that historical context. And with so many of the people, and especially the leaders in the church coming from the Jewish background, it's a real temptation at this point to see your country being threatened. It's time to go back home. And so, there's all of these seem to fit really well into that historical context that we were talking about.
It's a good point, and we see so many examples. I think of Matthew 23 at the beginning of that when Jesus is talking to the Pharisees, or to the people about the Pharisees. And one of the statements that really sticks out to me when Jesus is going through that dialogue is, they sit on the throne of Moses, so listen to what they say, but do not do what they do. Right?
Yeah.
I mean,
and they gild the outside of the tomb.
Right, exactly.
Inside it's corrosion, but man, look at the outside.
It's the definition of being lovers of self.
Yeah.
And
proud and abusive and all those everything.
Things. And abusive to their own people. And as you mentioned, here's the thing I think we get caught up in sometimes with this disobedient to parents one. We think this pertains, when we hear the word parents, we automatically think children.
Yeah, 4-year-old.
So we're talking about, a 4-year-old not listening to their parents. I'm not saying that this wouldn't cover that, but I'm just saying I don't think that's what Paul's targeting here.
No.
I think he's talking about parents.
These
or
are not
adults
the terrible
abusing
times.
Parents. Yeah.
Abandoning your parents.
Sure.
If a man will not care for his own family, then he's worse than an infidel.
That's right.
That Paul keeps going back to that. The orphans and the widows. He'll take care of them because they don't have anybody to take care of them. But he says, it's a disgrace to look at the way some people are treating their parents.
Yeah, and so I think, just like we look at the rest of this list, these are some pretty serious accusations to level. And so I don't think he's talking about, little Timmy talking back to his parents. I think he's talking about a serious violation of the concept of honoring our mother and father and hanging them out to dry. And I mean, when we go back and you look at that teaching,
as if I hadn't got any responsibility towards them at all.
Yeah, you look at that teaching on Corban, they're literally trying to use God to get out of taking care of their parents. When your heart's in a place where you're doing that, I mean, that is a bad, that's a symptom of a bad condition that's taken precedence in your life.
Horrible. Well, terrible times.
Correct. Ungrateful. And you look at this list, a lover of money, lover of self, and ungrateful somehow gets into this list of things that's going to include, as the ESV talks about, swollen with conceit, lovers of pleasure, all these things. And it's like, how does ungrateful make this list? But when you really think about it, being ungrateful is kind of, to me, it goes back to, what was the word he used in verse 17 of chapter 2? Gangrene. That's what ungratefulness is. If you begin to have an attitude that's ungrateful, it will permeate into every aspect of your life. And truly, a lot of these things that we're reading about are probably driven by being ungrateful.
Disobedient to their parents, not wanting to take care of them, not grateful for the fact that they're raised. Plus, if we're dealing here, with the Jewish nation, primarily historical context, ungrateful to God. His son came. They've been waiting for a couple of thousand years, and they killed him.
Yeah.
That would appear to be somewhat ungrateful.
It's like the parable that Jesus gives where they kill the servant that comes out.
Yeah.
But surely if I send my son, right? So ungratefulness, I mean, it can just cause havoc in our hearts. Unholy, kind of self-explanatory.
Which is the reason why you're ungrateful.
Correct. Verse 3, heartless, unappeasable, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not loving good. That's my translation. What does the NIV have there? Like
says,
for heartless.
Without love, unforgiving, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not lovers of the good.
Okay. So without love or heartless.
I think each translation has an interesting angle that it points to that is present in the word.
Correct.
That's where you really get, having two things. They're not contradicting, they're amplifying.
And I think we look at, heartless, again, that's kind of, to me, a little bit, that's kind of self-explanatory to a certain extent. But this idea of unappeasable, yours has what was it?
Unforgiving.
Unforgiving. Unappeasable or unforgiving. I think about this idea.
That really is good.
Yeah. You look around today, and this idea of being unappeasable, I think if we're discontent about something, we have to, at least to ourselves, be able to articulate how we're going to bring resolution to it.
Yeah.
Instead of just saying, well, I'm just going to be angry all the time about everything, or I'm just going to cause a ruckus about everything, because then you're being unappeasable.
Yeah, there's nothing you can do that's going to calm me down.
Correct.
I am going to work this. I'm going to hold this grudge. I'm going to do all this stuff. There's nothing you can do. You might as well just forget it.
And, man, that is a prevalent attitude in the world in which we live. And, again, I'm sad to say sometimes the church, when the world puts that pressure on and we're trying to connect or identify with the world, we begin to reflect that same attitude towards people.
Both of us have heard people say, I can't go over there because so-and-so attends. Well, you got something against your brother here. Yeah, and well, you need to go. No, not going to do it. There's nothing they can say that would convince me that they're sorry. I don't believe they repented. I don't believe they're sorry. Unappeasable. There's nothing you can do. If Jesus had been unappeasable, we would all be in a horrible condition.
We'd be in big trouble.
But we think it's okay for us.
It takes me back to Matthew 18 with the unmerciful servant, the parable that Jesus gives there, and this huge burden that is forgiven by the master, and then immediately the servant who had been forgiven so much goes out to demand minutia from peer of his.
That was, it's a pretty serious amount. It's couple 100 work days or something like that, but
he was forgiven 15,000 work days or something.
Yeah, well, it comes up to the total debt of several countries.
Yeah, exactly. So but it's so true, and we've been talking about a lot on Sunday mornings, the idea of discipleship, and one of the things I want to talk about is forgiveness, and how until we grasp and practice that, we're really not being disciples of Jesus.
Yeah.
I mean, when he teaches us to pray, he includes the concept of not only receiving, but giving forgiveness.
And if you can't forgive, you will not be forgiven.
I mean, that's the way.
1 Corinthians, he talks about love. One of the things is doesn't hold a record of grudges.
So unappeasable, and that attitude right now, I'm just talking about right now, and I'm sure it was then as well, but it is so prevalent in the world that if we're not careful as God's people to speak the truth and to remind ourselves of the truth, it will be easy for us to follow that leading into being unappeasable, unforgiving, and saying, look, because of this is where you're from, or this is what you look like, or this is who you are, I can't forgive you because, or you have this history, I can't forgive you. There's no room for that in the gospel.
No.
And Paul's writing that to Timothy.
Yeah, and it goes back to lovers of themselves. The only way you're ever going to get my forgiveness is if you just completely collapse and do everything I tell you to do.
Correct.
Leadership that is trying to have its own way.
Absolutely.
And, there's you have crossed me. The only way you're going to get back, you got to crawl, baby.
Yeah, and you look at some of the things, let's face it, we're talking about now in historical context of the letter that's written here, the struggles of circumcision and things like that. Until you're circumcised, I'm not going to view you as my brother. I'm unappeasable.
Unless you're circumcised, you cannot be saved.
Correct. So again, some of those things were just as evident then. Slanderous, I think that that's just kind of the next step in the process, right? I'm not going to forgive you, so obviously I'm not nothing good to say about you. So I'll just throw you under the bus while I'm at it, right?
Or the chariot.
Yeah, without self-control.
I'm not even going to try to control what I say.
Exactly. Brutal. Did yours have brutal as well?
Brutal.
I think when I think of the use here of brutal, I think without self-control almost as a prerequisite of brutal. I'm going to take this to the fullest extent beyond sufficient. I'm going to be brutal about it.
Well, it's the difference between love, which biblically love is not the emotional sappiness. It is, I want what's best for you. Now, if I'm not motivated by love, then I want what's worse for you.
Yeah.
And I'll see to it that you get it. That's brutal.
And again, we can go back to the previous list that's there at the end of chapter 2, and I think yours had, mine has patiently enduring evil. I think yours had without
Where is that? I'm
resentment.
sorry.
Chapter 2 and verse 24, able to teach, and then it says, yours said something like
Must be kind to everyone, able, not resentful.
not resentful, that's what it was. Mine
Yeah.
has patiently enduring evil. Resentful is what leads to brutal. You know, they talk about like murders and things like that, and it's one thing, it's a crime of like something happened in the moment, it's something else when you look and you say, this was personal to them. I mean,
Premeditated.
it went so far beyond what was necessary to just kill somebody that you can tell that they were, you know, it was brutal in its nature. And man, when we lose self-control and when we're completely unforgiving and ungrateful, it can lead our hearts and our actions to places that we would never intend. Judas being case in point. The brutal nature of what he did, that even he, after it happens, regrets it and gives back what he was paid for it.
And, you know, you have to remember that nasty as our world can get, the Romans were brutal. You know, they
The Jewish
They
people
took-
could be brutal too.
they could.
Crucify him.
yeah, and, you know, 40 lashes save one, but, you know, the Romans perfected crucifixion. It had been around for a long time, but they perfected it.
Sure.
They knew exactly how to use it. And, you know, they would come in and, you know, if you didn't surrender your city, then not only would they take your city down, they'd sow salt in there to make sure nobody ever gets it. They would wipe out an entire city just because, you know, one or two criminals might be harbored there.
Sure.
So, you know, the Romans were absolutely brutal. And Paul says that, you know, sometimes the way we treat each other, we might as well be Romans.
And you know, I think in my mind that brings up a point here as we're looking at all this stuff. These are all characteristics of Rome. I mean, the way you would kind of define the people, the government there, just the way that things were done. And how does this stuff end up appearing among God's people when things get tough? It's what was going on in the culture, and the church caves to that culture and begins to reflect it instead of being a light that distinguishes itself from the darkness. It's just kind of like absorbs into it.
Yeah.
And I think, again, just going to today, we have to be so careful and we have to be willing to look at ourselves. And if our message, if everything we're saying just happens to align perfectly with all the things that culture says we should be saying, society says is important, so on and so forth, if we're so...
Who needs us?
Yeah, if we're so in line with what they're doing, we're not salt anymore. We're not light anymore. And we're beginning to, for the sake of I think good intention, I guess. You know, I think some churches and people think they're trying to reach the world, and so they must become like the world. But again, that is anti-gospel. That's the opposite of what Jesus says.
When you think the government is the answer, you have to become like the government.
And so all these things are qualities of Roman people. But in these days when things become difficult, you got to watch for these. And he distinguishes it before, saying this is what the servant of the Lord should be like, and after he contrasts it with godly people. Because Paul's case after this is going to be, remember how I was. I wasn't like any of that stuff.
Yeah. And, you know, and I hate to say it, but enter into the election season, every one of these things is about to start popping up all over the place.
Sure. Well, it already has been popping up.
Already has, but now it's really going to get ugly.
It gets amplified.
Yeah.
It gets amplified.
Because this is... And is this really what we want our government to be?
And again, we have to be careful, and when we see that happening, not to engage in the same thing out of vitriol for what's happening.
Yeah.
We have to distinguish ourselves from what we call good, and evil, evil. We want to do that. But we don't want to become so engaged and overcome with what the world is saying is important. You know, one of the phrases that's going to come out in a sermon someday, but I'm not at church because I care about who you vote for. I care about who you worship. That's what I care about. When you get who you worship right, that will help guide your decision of who you vote for. But I'm not there to convince, the church isn't there to convince you of who to vote for.
Yeah.
It's there to convince you of who you need to be worshiping.
Yeah, but on the other hand, how many people do you have that will not sit with somebody else because they belong to the other political party?
And that's where all this comes in.
Yeah.
You know, and that's
where
anti-gospel.
it's completely anti-gospel. It's not just ungospel, it's anti-gospel. Give Caesar what belongs to Caesar, gives God what belongs to God. Shouldn't be any doubt about which one the Christians should be most clear on.
Correct. And again, if we get who we worship right, that will inform our decisions of who we vote for, and it will inform our decisions of how we treat people. And if you're getting the byproducts of getting who you worship right, then you may not be worshiping who you think you are.
Yeah.
You know?
And, however the election turns out, that first one, lovers of themselves. If I don't get who I want, there's going to be problems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so and it doesn't matter which one it is, the same reaction from the winners and the losers.
And Paul's writing in a time where
they didn't even have elections.
You're not electing anybody. People get leadership changes when somebody assassinates somebody else.
Yeah.
And the first one that gets there gets the spot of power,
Mm-hmm. Which Nero's about to prove with the year of the 4 emperors.
Sure. And there's this unifying that has to take place in the church.
No matter what they do, we are the church.
Correct. So
now that's probably going to lead to persecution.
Yeah. Oh, it does. It definitely does.
Because neither political party represents Christianity.
Correct.
Or any of the other 6,000 ones that are out there.
Correct.
None of them represent Christianity.
I agree. This at the end of verse 3, not loving good, again, sounds so simple on the surface. But we're to be lovers of good as Christians. What does it mean to be a lover of good? If I love something, I'm going to seek to have as much of it in my life as possible. Mm-hmm. I'm going to distance myself from anything that is not, whatever that is. If I love ice cream, I'm going to try as much ice cream as I can. Like my daughter does, no veggies. But if I love it, and I'm reminded of it her whole life. There's always, I'm full and I have no room. And then you say there's ice cream. I have room for that.
Well, there's like that'll melt and, spread.
Fills in the gaps,
Yeah.
So lovers of good, I think, is important.
Yeah, and, you contrast that. There's an obvious change here in verse 2. Mm-hmm. Lovers of themselves, lovers of money, not lovers of the good.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, it's important for us as Christians, as simple as that sounds, if we love good things, if we love not good things, not objects, it's not talking about material, but if we love what is good, and
all things
Peter
good.
Makes a long list of those things, what is good, what is noble. So that's important. Then it gets into treacherous, reckless.
Okay, but hang on, we're out of time. So, right. Much as I hate to quit in the middle of a verse, there's no way in the world we're going to cover that.
That's fine. That's all right.
So next week
be continued, right?
Yes, we will go home and take a shower after talking about all this stuff because it just makes you feel so dirty, especially when you consider it's in the church.
Sure.
But it doesn't have to be.
Correct.
And that's the whole point.
Mm-hmm.
So we will see you next week. I hope the study has been useful to you. You may have heard some things that you don't like. Maybe we need to ask ourselves why we don't like them. So we'll see y'all later.
Take care. And remember, if you do have any questions or comments, please feel free to email us, and we will address them as we have time next class. Take care.
Thank you.